welcome to IGF Studios Climate Matters. I'm Aarti Subramaniam, and we're going to be delving into the critical intersection of climate, business, and energy security. We're only a few weeks away from the COP28 summit in Dubai, and the need to fulfill the obligations of the Paris Agreement have never been this pressing. But to limit the rise in global temperatures, what's necessary is a shift to cleaner and greener energy, as well as to curb global emissions. But the war in Ukraine and global economic sluggishness have made this clean energy transition an extremely complicated one. To decode this challenge, Mitika Bajpai, Senior Sustainability Manager from Reliance Industries, joins us in this series. She is a sustainability strategist who's passionate about solving real world problems.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
I mentioned this is a complicated challenge, and I think critical to solving this complicated challenge is going to be, and I don't mean it to be so alliterative, but three C's. And I call that clean energy, carbon capture, and circular economy. These are three topics I know you're deeply passionate about. So I wanted to streamline this conversation along those lines. As I mentioned, we're just a few weeks away from COP28, and phasing out fossil fuels and doing so in a time bound manner is going to be extremely crucial to that. Now, there's a lot of controversy about phasing out or phasing down. And I think phasing down is often used as a compromise solution. But how realistic do you think is it going to be to phase out fossil fuels? And do you see a consensus developing before COP28?
Right, I think people are focusing a lot on the out or the second word here. My focus area would be to the word phase. Why I'm calling this as an important word is because it is important to acknowledge that it is a transition, right? We are transitioning away from our existing way of being to a new way of being. Now, some countries have the luxury of calling it also a leapfrog in the sense they haven't seen alternate forms of development, which is why they have an option to jump ahead to sort of a futuristic way of living and being. But more importantly, I think the underlying question we need to be asking ourselves is we have a limited resource. What is the best possible way to utilize that resource for the masses as opposed to just for certain gains or certain geopolitical powers to gain access to? When I talk about access, I mean energy access and energy security as well, right? But I think it's safe for us to say that fossil fuels can certainly provide us with energy, but more importantly, it can provide us with petrochemicals and other material building blocks which are currently irreplaceable as we speak today. And I'm sure there will be future technologies that we will find alternate solutions to. But at this stage, in addition to energy, there are other forms of chemical utilizations that we can look at. So when we talk about phase out or phase in, I think it's important for us to consider what stage of development a country is in, or what stage of development the ecosystem is in. What is the need of the hour in terms of energy security, energy access? How do we ration out the limited resource that we currently have to optimally utilize it in the context that we are looking at? What that means is if you're living in a country with energy poverty, your first and foremost target should be to try and find a way to provide energy access, right? If
Mhm.
you're at a development stage where you want to grow further, that's when you start talking about energy security. With, as you very correctly pointed out, the Russia-Ukraine war. Even the so-called developed nations, right, are still struggling with finding a short energy source that sadly is not fossil fuel dependent. And while we're developing all the clean energy technologies, we also need to be mindful of the storage challenge, right? So while we can generate clean energy, where we store it, how do we provide access to it without compromising on development, without compromising on the quality of life that we want to offer to everybody? How do we balance both of these out? I think that is the bigger challenge. And I certainly think there are certain countries that need to be far more ambitious than certain others in this conversation. I think that's why that's what's most exciting about negotiations that are carried out at COP at any stage.
Mhm. But I think that's the other issue, isn't it? The inherent inequity in developed
Mm.
countries versus developing countries, the differential responsibilities. I think that's a keyword that India uses a lot when it comes to climate negotiations as well. Striking that right balance between ensuring lives and livelihoods are not damaged, but at the same time to ensure that we have a future world, to look forward to.
Absolutely. I think my biggest learning when I got into the space of sustainability was to go beyond the jargons and the definition and just ask yourself, what can we uniquely do that the world of tomorrow needs? Right?
Mm.
If this was taught to me by one of my dear professors, and I really thank him to date for it because it boils down the question to a very simplified manner. It is not about what do I need at this stage of development, how am I going to compromise and meet my targets, but it is more about how can we collaborate? How can we uniquely come together to actually solve the issue? And I think that is the biggest shift between global challenges that we've seen in the past versus what we have today. In the past, it was always one economic power, two economic powers that could join forces and sort of solve the challenge at hand, right? Be it the agricultural crisis we've seen in the past, the industrial revolution that we've seen in the past. We've seen that narrative work well. You have two to three different global giants come together and solve for the challenge at hand. Whereas that
Mhm.
is not what is happening with this resource. We need to acknowledge the fact that it is a shared resource. It goes beyond land jurisdictions as we know it. It
Mm.
is a global phenomena wherein a wildfire in one part of the country or in one part of the globe will definitely have implications in the other part, right? It's not just an immediate pollution challenge that you face in a certain jurisdiction. There are correlations between what's happening with the polar caps versus what's happening with sea level rise in the tropics. So that correlation goes beyond the land jurisdiction that we are aware of, which is why the collaboration solutions also need to be drastically different. Wherein
Yeah.
it's not just about who comes out to be on top or who has the maximum resources, because of course you're still living in a capitalistic world wherein all of this comes at a cost. But what is the trade-off that you're willing to bear at that cost?
Hmm. You spoke of global solutions, global collaboration. I think one of the biggest headlines and takeaways from the recently concluded G20 summit in Delhi was the Global Biofuels Alliance as well. Now, how significant would you say this is for addressing energy security concerns? And is this a magic bullet that everyone's been looking for?
Right. So I think that's the biofuel space is the most fascinating because it is essentially closing the loop. I think it's also touching upon your second aspect of circularity, right? Um, when we are looking at systems, we don't just want to live in a make and waste economy. It shouldn't be a linear solution. You have to look at a circular economy in every aspect. So what that essentially means, you're not just talking about creating the same product or same resource again. You want to try and find all possible ways to eliminate waste, right?
Yeah.
That's what's most exciting about the biofuel economy because you're literally translating agro waste to a fuel that can help you generate the electricity and energy you need to process. I think that is an important transition piece that we are talking about. So while we are waiting for solar, hydrogen, wind, whatever other technologies all countries are focusing on, while we are waiting for that to develop at a scale that we need it to be at, this is a very good transition and a rapidly available, accessible transition fuel to consider. The biofuel alliance is not only important from a waste management point of view, in the sense what countries choose to do with their waste, but it also creating a lot of new opportunities in the economy, saying that now what most countries consider as an informal economy, which is the waste economy, can now be capitalized on and brought back into the system such that you're extracting value out of essentially
Hmm.
waste, right?
Yeah. No, so it's not just about, in that sense, it's not just about finding newer, cleaner sources, but also sustainability practices and new technology to really harness that, which entails reducing waste or utilizing that waste elsewhere. That's the circular economy principle. But how can industries and businesses effectively transition to the circular model, especially in the energy sector, and what do they get from it?
Right. So I think depending on location, it's something you can capitalize on. I know, for example, Reliance for a fact has a couple of their petrochemical sites that have been utilizing biofuels for a while now, and scaling that up has been a challenge historically for companies because of the lack of supply chains and what we consider as waste, right? But now what is happening with such alliances, wherein countries are coming together to say yes, that we will facilitate the movement of such supply chains, right? We will facilitate the movement of formalizing what used to be an informal economy. We'll facilitate the movement of what is considered as waste to be able to get it to a place wherein you can extract value from it, right? I think that was the biggest gap. It was to try and figure out how do you formalize such a massively informal economy, and how do you capitalize on um, resources that are otherwise being wasted. That's one aspect. Once you've got your supply chain conundrum sorted, the next step is to find a way to utilize it in the best possible industrial solution that you have available. India is, of course, a agro-based economy, so I can speak on from the Indian context. You have agricultural land across the country, and you have four crop cycles essentially, right? So you have something running all throughout the year, which means there is agro waste available all year round in some manner or the other. Now, if you have waste available all year round, what we now need to do is find the right supply chain sources for collection, for segregation of the waste and the right capacity, and building the right infrastructure to extract electricity, energy, power out of this particular waste ecosystem. Developing that ecosystem, of course, is a capital cost for any company, any industry. Uh, but I think the returns for it is something that will pay out depending on how the alliances work out and how you what economics you consider for something like a waste resource, in particular agro waste resource. But I think there's more than just agricultural waste that companies are world over also exploring, and that should be an interesting aspect. Let's see how that plays out. But I that is more out of curiosity uh, than proof of concept just yet.
But where are we now when it comes to that? Where is India and where are countries around the world when it comes to adopting a sustainability practice like this? Which is and also how much does it? And that's the underlying thing about shifting to a green energy, right? What is the cost?
The cost aspect has to be broken down to which technologies you're focusing on. People have access to monetary resources and that have access to, say, land to be able to generate with renewable energy resources would probably want to do it in a decentralized way, saying that I have my own property. I would make sure that I have running water, that's rainwater recycled. I have decentralized solar that is helping me run whatever equipment I need in the house. But going beyond that, how do you go beyond? How do you get people that don't have that equitable amount of resources available to them? How do you get them to have that level of energy access? How do you get them to have that level of comfort in transitioning away from traditional fossil fuel sources to these new fuel sources? Now, I think we're also speaking from a very privileged lens. I think what we also forget quite often is that there are lots of majority of the population, a little over 50% of the world population, is still not privileged enough to even have access to a cell phone, right? Just for somebody to be alive, that's an absolute basic amenity that they need to have access to. How are we meeting those needs without having to go back to the Stone Age, for example? I don't want to be lighting a fire and using timber in that context, but a lot of the population are still using exactly that. They are still using coal-based chulas, for example, in rural India, that is still running on um, the 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 least clean aspect of fossil fuel sources. You're not going to go around telling them, okay, please don't eat food because you're causing emissions. So
Right.
I would ask you to wait till the solar power is available in your area and you utilize it then. That's not the narrative you want to go with. But I think that's the shift in mindset that we really need to consider. Saying, how
No,
do
I
you provide? And yeah, sorry.
No,
Go
I was
ahead.
just going to say that's a really valid point, right? Balancing climate goals while ensuring that affordable, reliable energy sources are available, especially in developing countries, and that dependence on fossil fuels is going to be there. How do you slowly wean away from it? And over the years, carbon has acquired this bad rep, and of course, rightly so. But now you have technologies such as carbon storage and utilization, which is turning carbon into a valuable asset and might be perhaps the solution to this or the solution to this balance.
Absolutely. So I don't think it's a one-size-fit-all policy. I think CCUS is a great option. Carbon capture, storage, and utilization is a great technological solution to some of the problems. But I don't think we should put all our eggs in one basket. One,
Mhm.
because it's something we are still exploring. Direct air capture is something that only a handful of countries, a couple of the European countries, a couple of North American countries have been successful in trying to explore the same. And it is still at a stage where the quantities are too small to even offset a country's emissions. Even if the country that is doing it is quite small in terms of emitting it. Um, I think what has been successful stories is carbon capture, storage, and sequestration. When we talk about storage in the context of sequestration. So I think Bhutan is an easy example. Everyone world over talks about it in terms of reforestation and what they've done in terms of creating carbon sinks from a nature-based solution point of view, which essentially means um, they have more trees than per capita anything, to be honest, economy, number of people in the country, everything, any other metric you want to consider. And that's a very substantial and significant change that they've made in their lifestyle. And that also reflects in their ethos and the country's sort of geopolitical stance as well. But that's just one success story. What is also happening is in trying to promote um, reforestation or nature-based solutions, they are also trying to create a financial market to help fund that.
Mhm.
Right? I think that's where the gap is. It's carbon capture, storage, and utilization as a technology requires investment, but so does nature-based solutions. I think everyone world over is exploring the idea of carbon capture and storage. Um,
Yeah.
Utilization is also an exciting piece because I think we discussed this earlier as well. People consider carbon as, or people just associate carbon as a bad thing in today's narrative, right? But carbon is
Mm.
essentially a life form, right? You and I are alive because we have some amount of carbon in our bodies and our lives and everything around us, right? So carbon is not essentially elementally a bad thing. It's just perceived to be a negative externality of industrialization, right?
Mm.
So, how do we look at it as not a waste resource, but as a resource that we can extract more and more value from,
Yeah.
right? I think the moment we start talking about carbon from a utilization point of view, or as opposed to just something that we need to throw money at to try and get rid of, I think that's where a lot of the circularity aspects will change, right? So when we talk about circularity, it is about looking at not just materials economy, but also the carbon economy.
Yeah.
So I think that is again a very exciting space to be at.
No, I think you're really passionate about this subject, and of course, it's yeah. You said it's a quite a bad reputation, and how do you convert that into an asset? How do you convert it and use it beyond? You can't just talk about carbon emissions and carbon footprint. There has to be, like you said, it is an essential element that we need to look at. I want to take you back to something else that you mentioned earlier, though. You said there is a lot of jargon in this in this ecosystem. Another word that we hear a lot these days is green hydrogen. Now, I know there are people who are betting big on green hydrogen, and that's become the latest buzzword in clean energy. How does it stack up compared to other clean energy sources, and what are the benefits, environmental benefits, compared with some others?
Right. So, hydrogen actually has a lot of colors. Let me start by telling you that. You have pink hydrogen, you have blue hydrogen, you have green hydrogen, you have gray hydrogen, you have brown hydrogen. The list is quite long in terms of the number of colors you have access to, right? That's the whole jargon bit that I'm talking about when it comes to hydrogen. I think what's exciting about hydrogen is, or why it's gaining a lot of traction is, it's an alternate fuel source. I think what's exciting about hydrogen is it can store the most amount of energy in a fuel quantity of its size, and utilize the energy form in large scale manufacturing as well. So I think not um, sort of not exactly aviation fuel, but you can find substitutes to large scale transportation by finding the right hydrogen fuel mix for your
Hmm.
manufacturing and transportation ecosystems. I think that's what's exciting most people. But uh, I know a lot of people who are far more qualified than me to be talking about this subject. My interest in this space is purely in the context of what two aspects. If we are transitioning away from traditional fuel economics to green hydrogen, just to break down the jargon of green hydrogen here. Green hydrogen is basically hydrogen generated from renewable energy sources, right? So something that's probably generated from either solar or from wind or the likes of that, to help generate hydrogen as a fuel. Um, now, what's interesting is if you're transitioning away from traditional fuel sources to green hydrogen, because it's a liquid fuel as well, or in certain cases, other aspects too. How do you move away from transportation fuels that are existing in this space? So the what happens to the automobile industry in the near future with hydrogen coming into the picture is very exciting because people are considering EVs or electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles to be considered as an intermediary in this space because everyone's looking forward to having the hydrogen economy drive the automobile sector. Now, if the automobile sector is willing to transition that rapidly to hydrogen, what happens to the remaining transportation ecosystem? So, what happens to your fleets? What happens to your air transport? How fast can they adapt to something like this? I think hydrogen has a very long way to go. This goes without saying. But if you find the right economic balance for hydrogen, it is a very good and cost effective, it can prove to be a very good and cost effective solution to your traditional fuel economics with with the right safety features added to it.
Like I started off by saying, of mentioning COP28 and how we're just a month or so away from it. What are your hopes and expectations from COP28? What would you like to see happen? Now, obviously, expectations and reality, there's always a huge gap. In what would you like to see happen at COP28?
Right. So, adaptation, mitigation, and funding. These are my three big expectations from COP, not just as, somebody who's hopeful about the future, but also somebody who would like more direction at a global level and more consensus at a global level to try and achieve something fruitful. When we talk about adaptation, it's great to know that COP27 has been successful, at least in this context, to get people to commit to adaptation funds, right? That has
Mhm.
been a very crucial portion of the conversations going on so far, because not many people are talking about adaptation, and by that is, I think there's a certain mindset saying that okay, adaptation should be a scenario only when mitigation fails, but that is not the case. Not You need to work on both of them as actively as you are on the other because adaptation will reap benefits not just now for the island nations, but 10 years down the line for countries that are under threat of sea level rise. And actually, probably lesser than that. A lot of countries face severe sea level rises even as early as 2030, right? So 10 years is still pretty far away. Um, so yes, adaptation is a very important conversation. I'd like to see more traction on that to see where the funds are being allocated, who is putting in how much. And I'm looking forward to seeing more commitments from countries who've had the privilege of being industrialized for over 100 years. So that should be an exciting space in the context of adaptation. In the context of mitigation, I'm actually looking forward to seeing a lot more progress on the targets made. Right. So while we have the SDG tracker and global trackers talking about progress on climate action and net zero progress of a handful of countries that are making that are making their commitments public, that have made their commitments public. It'd be interesting to see how the national development plans evolve for some of the countries and how much are they willing to invest in the context of mitigation. And gradually, when we talk about funding, I'm not just talking about the money that is going into adaptation and mitigation, but also how countries are going to facilitate global fund transfers for climate action technological investments, and nature-based solution investments. So it could be in the context of cap and trade, it could be in the context of mechanisms like cap and trade, it could be in the context of regulations, it could be in the context of credits um, that are measured with the right additionality clauses. But yeah, I think these three is something I'm looking forward to, and it'd be great to see more and more consensus and more action translated to beyond the conversations that are happening.
Well, let's hope for consensus and not conflict. Mitika, thank you so much. I think we can keep our fingers crossed and hope that there is, definitive action towards making sure that this is a sustainable, greener, safer planet for us all. Mitika, thank you so very much for taking time out and speaking to us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Aarti. Thank you for having me here.